Now, since the very beginning of the Super Mario games, Nintendo has used themed levels to create all kinds of cool and different adventures. And one type of level that has a huge impact on the player, as well as the mechanics seen in there, is water. And today we will take a look at these in order to find out how they evolved over the years when it comes to design, story, gameplay, and use. Now let's dive right in. Now all of this started in 1985, of course, back when the very first Super Mario Bros. Game was released on the NES. Back in those days, they were quite limited when it comes to the console's power, as well as the amount of data that could actually fit on the cartridge. And so they did stuff like reusing assets. A great example of this is the water and lava scene in the game, which looks the same except for the color. So of course, thanks to that, this game couldn't go completely wild. They were certainly limited. Now these levels are very different from the normal ones seen in the game, and that's mostly because of one element: the water. In the game, your oxygen doesn't really matter, so the whole time you're swimming, going from left to right. However, because you're in the water, you can swim up and let yourself sink down, which has a huge impact on the level. Jumping is not relevant anymore, and the whole screen is your playground all of a sudden. You don't have to deal with gravity anymore. As you can imagine, this has a huge impact on how you play, as well as the actual level design that Nintendo comes up with. Moving around in levels like this is completely different from any other type of levels seen in this game and all the ones that came after. Now in these levels, a lot of special underwater enemies are also featured, such as Cheep Cheeps and bloopers. Now I will cover these briefly, because I already did individual evolution of videos on them. This goes for a lot of enemies in this video. You can find a lot of those videos in the upper right corner, by the way. Now the blooper moves around in quite weird ways. It shoots up at an angle quite quickly, and then slowly comes down. This can really confuse the player, and it also takes up quite a big portion of the screen, limiting movement. And then we have the Cheep Cheeps, who are just normal fish that swim from right to left. In a way, they're similar to the goombas. Clearly, so far the water levels are quite simple, but in the next game they took it all a step further. We saw them in Super Mario Bros. 3 as well. Sure, they skipped Super Mario Bros. 2, but that game wasn't based on Super Mario, but more on Doki Doki Panic. Now in the third game they were able to do a lot more. Sure, they didn't have any extra power, but they did get more efficient with it. And regardless of that, it's a lot more stylized. All of a sudden, instead of just coral, we see stuff like moving seaweed and moving waves on the top of the water. Things like this are small touches, but they certainly improve the underwater sections. Now in this game, Nintendo took everything a huge step further. They created a whole world around this stuff called Waterland. Here we see tons of water levels which are filled with the same enemies like we saw in the previous game, but they also added some new ones. Like the Big Berthas, who are huge Cheep Cheeps with babies, Gelectros, who are electric jellyfish, Nani Bloopers, who are bloopers with young that follow them, Lava Lotuses, which are plants that spew out fireballs, and Spiked Cheep Cheeps, who have more movement options. Clearly, it got a lot more crowded down there, and this time they were also able to use a wide range of enemies. And getting through these levels certainly got a lot harder. We even saw enemies down there that don't really belong there, like stretches. And so, in order to help the player a bit, a power-up was introduced that allowed you to swim faster, and it's known as the frog suit. Now, outside of the water, it wasn't really that great, but once you took a dive and were down there, you had a huge advantage compared to your normal form. Now, one other thing that was new in this game is levels where water is seen a lot below or in between platforms. In levels like this, all kinds of enemies could jump up out of the water to get you, like the hard-to-dodge boss bass. And if this huge Cheep Cheep gets you, you were likely screwed. In a way, stuff like this is very reminiscent of the lava bubbles. So Nintendo started to get really creative with the level design, enemies, and even power-ups that fit with the theme. They even added pipes that would push you away because of a water stream flowing out of it. As you can notice, this game was a huge step up. And before we move on to the next game, I want to share a little Easter egg with you all. The chain of islands seen in Waterland are in the shape of Japan, with the castle being located where the city of Kyoto is. and that's also where the headquarters of Nintendo is, so it's clear that they designed it after that. Now on to the next game, Super Mario Land, a game made for the Game Boy, and this one did a lot of things differently because it was made by a different team. In this game's underwater levels, you're not swimming around. Instead, you use a submarine that can shoot torpedoes, which kill enemies. And thanks to this, these levels became more like some sort of auto-scrolling arcade shooter, and so a lot of enemies were seen in it as well as obstacles. Think of things like brick block walls, small fish that would swim towards you at the speed of a bullet, new seahorse enemies that shoot stuff at you, big octopuses, and even a boss. Clearly, this stuff was very different compared to the previous title. It's even very different compared to normal levels, acting more as some sort of high-paced, action-packed shooter arcade game. Like one of those old ones, you know? Personally, I think it's quite cool and refreshing, but in the end, this concept wouldn't stick. In the next game, Super Mario World, it would go back to the concepts seen in Super Mario Bros. 3 and expand upon them. In general, not too many things changed. Sure, more puzzle elements were introduced, but this was the case in a lot of levels seen in this game, thanks to items like the P-switch being used more. Aside from that, no enemies were added that were really special. Most were just bigger, faster, or got spiky. That's it. So this game didn't introduce anything too exciting. Sure, the levels looked better and better with each game, but at some point Nintendo wasn't putting in as much effort. However, I do have to admit, the underwater ghost ship level was really cool, and it's certainly among my favorite underwater levels ever seen in the franchise. Now in the next game, we saw that things were getting stale as well. Super Mario Land 2 was also a lot like Super Mario World and Super Mario Bros. 3. Although I do have to say that again, we saw a cool underwater boss, and those are always a highlight in my opinion. Now the next 2D game in line was released more than 10 years later, and it's known as New Super Mario Bros., where the world is in 2.5D all of a sudden. In this game we saw a couple of new additions. New enemies were introduced, and some of these do something truly new, like the Unagi, who either swim around and take up a huge portion of the screen, or they randomly come out of some sort of random hole surprising the player. But overall, things got a lot calmer down there in the sea, and even when you're going over it on platforms. Enemies like the jellyfish and big Cheep Cheeps who will jump for you or shoot their kids at you are gone now. In general, this game has a similar amount of underwater enemies, but they were just less deadly. Well, in my opinion. Now another thing we started to see in these levels is mini-games. Think of things like the red rings that spawn coins, and collecting these will give you a power-up or something. Or the P-switches that spawn 1 billion coins that you can also collect, so you can spend them later or even get an extra life. Stuff like this wasn't seen at all, or at least not this much in the previous games. Only Super Mario World experimented with concepts like this. But in that game you mostly found alternative routes, which New Super Mario Bros. Has as well. However, in general, it's quite clear that this new 2D Mario took it all a step further, and in order to give the player a better chance, they introduced another underwater power-up, the Blue Shell. When you have it, you can shell dash around on land, which can be really strong, and it allows you to swim faster and with more precision. As you can imagine, this would really help you complete those minigames, as well as dodging foes. And for once, this power-up is also useful on land. Now the last big thing we saw in this game was a new underwater boss enemy, although it is similar in a lot of ways to the Big Bass. Now in the next game, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, not a whole lot changed. We saw way more Cheep Cheeps and some new enemies like a clam, and these act like a classic trap enemy. But in general, none of the new enemies or things seen in these levels were that original. They had already been seen in previous games in some way, shape or form, and this would sadly enough become the standard for the other games that came after as well. Not a whole lot of new things were introduced. Sure, we saw some new enemies, but their tactics and behavior would be similar to all the others seen in the past. This is actually something Nintendo does often, especially when it comes to traps. To be honest, there are only 2 new ones in the later games that really stood out. The Torpedo Teds, which are underwater versions of the Bullet Bills, and the Dragon Eel, which is a huge snake-like fish that looks stunning, but would also limit your movement options. These 2 new enemies were certainly memorable and played quite a big role in New Super Mario Bros. U. But that was for sure the last major addition. After this, Nintendo would release the Super Mario Maker games, and here the players were in charge, and they just gave them all the tools to do whatever they wanted. But still, as you have seen, the underwater levels in the Super Mario franchise changed quite a lot. And if you people want, I will also cover the 3D water levels, because those are quite different, and there's a whole lot more to cover.